He's going to talk about um, security as an enabler and risk management. So, Dan, you are set to go.
Great. Well, thanks everybody, and I hope the 2 days have been going very well. I'm very excited to be here because, as those who know me know, I'm very much a believer that security is and can be a business enabler. But today we're going to talk about some of the ways that security, if not done, can also be an inhibitor. I try to stay away from the doom and gloom, from the fear, uncertainty, and doubt. But I think it's important to understand some of the context of the day that we're working in, and how it pertains, and how spending time up front, spending time making sure that systems are secure, planning ahead, can relieve a lot of issues over the long term. And we're seeing play out in the public, some of the very real implications of not doing so. I will go from here. So when we started talking about this conference, the thing that Jill said to me was the focus of the conference is, why is it so important for people to invest in their systems? And I use this as the thread to talk about for today. And I wanted to reiterate it because I think it is important, especially as it comes to security. There's a metric a little later, but I'll put it up. I'll talk about it now, that fixing things, and this includes bugs, it includes security items, fixing things later, after something has gone to production or after something has become an issue, can be 100 times more costly than spending time and money doing it early. So the theme of today's discussion will be proactiveness, and ways that you can start to address things proactively. But before we go into that, when people talk about information security, there is often the first stop that people make is at the top of this triangle. And we in the field think of this as what we call it the CIA Triad. There are three major components that make up information security. And confidentiality is the one that comes to everybody's mind first and foremost. How do we protect things from getting out? But there are two equally important, and I think in modern day, rising elements that are becoming more and more commonly understood as part of information security, but they've always been there, are that of integrity and availability. And in this space, in our space, the idea of research, the idea of data, the idea of scholarly content being accurate, integrity really plays into, how do we store things safely? How do we make sure they're unchanged? How do we make sure that when they're presented, they are accurate? If you're doing research, how do you make sure that the things you're recording are untampered? When you go back to look at large data sets later, how do we make sure that those things are as the original researcher, as the original documenter created them? So the topic of integrity, especially in this day and age of increased tampering, we don't, non-physical copies, it's very easy to make changes to digital things. Planning and building systems to account for integrity is more and more important. It's not just locking the front door. And then the other is availability. We operate in a world of technology systems, and I'll give you a personal example. I mentioned earlier, I'm on holiday this whole week in a remote part of Southeast Ohio, which is beautiful, but it doesn't have strong connectivity when you go off of the main roads. And you come to realize that many systems expect, demand that you be constantly connected. And if you have a small trickle connection, it actually is just as complex, if not worse, to be able to get at things. Systems and technology expect you're on high-speed lines. They expect systems are always available. Some things need to be available, and you need to be able to get at them quickly and always. So it's not just about the connectivity, but it's also about highly available systems. We'll talk a little bit about patching in a little bit, but things like that, these three items, keep these in mind as we talk through the rest of the session here, so that we can, you can understand that we're talking about this in the whole space of information security, not just confidentiality. Security is always in the news, and I pulled up two that I think are pertinent to this area, to this field. First of all, there's been a barrage of outside influence of attacks. We saw it again yesterday in some of the commentary coming out of the summit in Geneva. between the US and the Russians regarding attacks, regarding attempts to compromise systems, make systems unavailable, tamper with systems. All of those are part of the remit of information security. And if you're hosting systems that have any kind of information that people rely on, you need to know that, these are targets. Now, higher education, research, cities are increasingly being targeted, primarily because they oftentimes are under-resourced and hold very important things. The other is the focus on coronavirus specifically, but research in the area of coronavirus for the last year and a half. Well, since this whole thing started, we've been getting alerts from CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, from the FBI, from Interpol, and from various other law enforcement organizations about the persistent attempts to get at coronavirus research, either in its early stages, to attempt to influence it, or to be able to get at things like vaccine information or remedy information, either for commercial purposes or for more nefarious purposes. So these are two areas that are really high on the list right now, and talk again about integrity as much as they do about confidentiality, because if somebody goes in and makes changes to some of the research or work being done on these, then the outcomes could be dire. And I think I'd be hard pressed to find any one of you listening and watching that aren't aware of the idea of ransomware, but it's that big a deal right now that I'll mention it again. The higher ed space, which I spent the last year working in, and was the beneficiary of a ransomware attack. The threat of ransomware is significantly increasing, and it's not just in higher ed, it's not just in public spaces, it's also in the commercial spaces. And the ransoms, the dollars involved, are completely changing the way people look at these. There's insurance involved that is paying out in some cases. There's competing challenges from pending laws that say paying ransoms may become illegal in the US. All of this is in flux, but at the end of the day, we know that ransomware is happening, and why is it happening? And that's what we'll talk about next. Let's focus on the Colonial Pipeline. And I am not meaning to use this as a particular example, but it's the most recent. It's the loudest that we've heard we've heard it very loudly recently. And it is indicative of many of the things that we've seen across other ransomware attacks, across other attacks in general. And we find that in this, so first of all, they for those that don't know, the Colonial Pipeline, the organization had a ransomware attack. Systems were encrypted. They were unable to manage certain systems. They made a decision to stop oil flow. This raised prices. This reduced impact. Those of you who live on the east and southeast had times in which gas wasn't available due to this. So it had a significant societal impact. But when we start to get to the bottom of why it happened, it was two very interesting things. And one was a compromised password, a password that was found out in a trove that was out in the dark web that was being sold, an account, username, and password for something else that had been someone had used the same password as they did in a public site, as well as in their corporate. Turns out this person had also left the organization. They were no longer there. So now we have a person who left with access still remaining, and it was on a disused VPN. It was a VPN concentrator that was no longer in use. So it wasn't an active system, but it was still on and running and listening and waiting to take connections. So there's a whole bunch of things. And when I first started thinking about this talk, I wanted to go into some of the deeper items. But as we look at this, there's been this discussion amongst the information security community about a need for a return to basics. We've got all of these, I get daily 25 a day calls from vendors asking me to buy fancy new whiz-bang technology. But in reality, we're still not doing the basics well. And so if we talk about maintaining our systems, the things we can do either as publishers or as libraries or as service providers or aggregators or information professionals, we can do some things at basics that would have stopped many of the recent attacks that we see and hear about. And so I added this in because I think it's important. And these are things that we can all do and take within close to our organization, even if they're centralized IT, even if there is, even if systems are not necessarily in our direct control. These are things we can start to bring back and messages we can start to share to influence the impact of security. That doesn't mean going out and buying $1 million system. So first of all, passwords, we all hate them. I don't know if anybody really enjoys passwords. Please find me afterward. I'd love to have a talk. I'd love to know how and why. We all hate them, and we're really bad at setting them. So using password managers to set passwords and store passwords and make each one individual, it's almost a base layer thing. And you can do this on your own, even if your institution, now follow your institution's policies on this or your organization's policies, but you can set passwords. It can randomly generate them for you. And wherever possible, use multi-factor authentication to get into systems. If your organization has a single sign-on, hopefully either something like Okta or Ping or Microsoft SSO, things like that, Jump Cloud, any of those can be used as single sign-on. And multi-factor, the second factor after you enter the password, is important. In any systems where you log in yourself and you have the option to add multi-factor, do it. Passwords are being stolen and traded, and they're commodity. They're under $1 each for a large trove of well-known used passwords that are active. They're cheap, they're happening, and it's easily scriptable. So if you're using the same password in multiple places, it's going to get found. A multi-factor authentication then means you have to have something else with you in order to be able to get through. You have to get a text message, a push message, a number off of your phone, something that an attacker wouldn't have. This stops so many of the attacks that we would have had. Had multi-factor been in Colonial, they wouldn't have been able to get through that method. Have an inventory of the systems you operate. Know what systems are running. Even if you're a smaller area within a large organization, know what's in your area, know the systems, know what they do, know what software runs on. And this all leads to then know and watch for when those systems have patches and updates and security vulnerabilities. If you have a security organization, build a strong relationship with them. There's a large movement inside security to build stronger relationships and stop being the department of NO, and start becoming part of the business, start becoming part of the wider organization. If your CISO or security organization isn't ready for that yet, these are still things you can do on your own, and advise them and help them understand that you are watching out for these things. And I promise you they'll appreciate that. Limiting access to the things that people truly need. It's very easy to, if you're in an organization for a long time, to gather lots of rights. When you change jobs, it's very rare that people take away the rights you don't need from the old job. You start to aggregate them. These become a liability if that account becomes compromised. So go back and look at the things that people have in your organization, and take away the things that aren't needed. It's not going to hurt them. It's not going to hurt them in the heart to say you no longer, we're revoking this right. It's the right thing to do, because then people's accounts, when they get compromised, only can get to certain things. They can't necessarily. I know people who have been in places for 25, 30 years and basically have ubiquitous rights to the place. Go through and do some of those audits to understand what rights people have, and take away the thing you need. Access rights is not a way to make people feel better about their jobs. It really is an enablement. So please treat it that way. Turning off systems when they're no longer in use. If you're done with a server, turn it off. The only secure server is one that's turned off and in a closet locked away. So take one more step. Take it off the network. If it's not being used, if it's not active, and especially if you're not watching it or going into it, somebody may take it over and you may not even know, and they'll have access inside your networks. Turn off access when people leave the organization. It's not kind. It doesn't feel kind to say, you're leaving the organization today, we're going to turn off your access, 10 minutes before you're gone or as you're walking out the door. But it really does need to be something, because when somebody leaves, they often post about it. That's a way they post about it on LinkedIn. Attackers are looking for those things, and then they look through their lists and try and find people in that time gap. So shrinking the amount of time between the time somebody leaves and the time their access is turned off is ideal. Monitor your systems for changes from what normal is. People at the coalface, people who operate systems know what normal is on a system. Take a look, see if anything is out of norm. There's software to help see if files were changed, but at the very least, log in, look at folders, look at files, see if things have changed since the last time that you were there, somebody was there, and if they have, go with the spidey sense and call your information security organization to ask them to help you take a look, or take a look yourself if you have the skills to do so. And the last thing, which is actually the first thing, should be the first thing, is around educating. Educating. This space is so rooted in things like privacy. This space is so rooted in things like security and doing the right thing, that educating and passing that word on, not just to colleagues, but also to patrons and users and parts of our respective communities around the need for better security, helps mature all of society. And then we do this better. This is as much an individual thing as it is an organizational thing. Being conscious about weird emails and clicking on the link, being comfortable calling a CEO and saying, I got this mail from you asking me to send you iTunes gift cards. Did you really send that? I know it's not always comfortable to do so, but it's our responsibility as colleagues to do that for our organization, because those are the way that people get in, that attackers get in. So these are the fundamentals. These are the basics. Now let's move on to a little bit more proactively. First of all, baking security into your other development and operations planning. Security, it doesn't have to be its own thing. It shouldn't be its own thing. It should be part, if you're developing systems, security features or security stories should be along with feature stories, should be along with any other feature or operational items in your planning from the earliest cycles. They should be slotted in and be given the same kind of cycles in your development cycle. And plan so that you have, I'm using agile terminology, but 1 out of every X sprints, 1 out of every X weeks, 1 out of every X projects being pre-earmarked for security features, and then you decide what to fill it with as you get close to that time block. And then some percent of each sprint or week or project being earmarked for tactical security things. We know a week doesn't go by when something doesn't have to be addressed. So plan for it. And worst cases or best cases, there's nothing to do security-wise that week. You give that back to features, or you give that time back to some other operational or maintenance item. But booking it in and not trying to squeeze security fixes and planning into amongst other features or other maybe customer or user facing work means that you will have the time when you need it. The next is designing resiliency into your patching requirement. Designing resiliency into your system, and the specific reason is for patching. We often hear, well, we can take academic systems down twice a year during Christmas break and during winter break and summer break, but that's it. And that kind of patching cycle, that kind of down cycle for security maintenance isn't going to cut it anymore. We're seeing the time between something being announced and something being actively exploited and attacked coming way down. There was an issue just last week with VMware. I think within 12 hours from the time it was announced, there were active attacks in place. I'm not saying you have to plan for 12-hour patching every time. That was an extreme, but twice a year is not enough anymore. I mentioned earlier the idea that security costs up to 100 times more to fix later than to fix earlier. The other is complexity increases security. We're in a day and age when technology is available to all of us very easily. And it's not fun to have to go with the corporate standard. It's not, we may not do all the things we need to do. And I wrestle with this with security tools too. But the more complex the environment is, the more different things there are that do things, the more risk there is of having security issues, because who's managing them all? Who understands them all? How do they interact with each other? This is important. Knowing your suppliers is increasingly important as well. Take a look at FireEye, at the issue with FireEye recently and SolarWinds. This was source code that had a vulnerability in it that was put in by attackers, sat there for years and was installed by many people, and then the attackers started to exploit it. This is hard to track down, but it starts with having a good, robust understanding of the security of the suppliers you use, because guess what? You bring their technology into your organization, you are only as strong as they and you combined are. And the last here is know how you'll respond and practice how you'll respond when an incident or a breach takes place. This doesn't just have to be with the security organization. If somebody calls the library, if somebody calls your publishing organization and says, we have your entire database, how are you going to respond? Have an idea of the things you need to know, practice them within your own organization. Again, back to guarantees. You guarantee if you call your security organization and say, we want to work on a tabletop exercise, a practice for a incident response, they will be very happy to help and comply and help you along with that. And if not, call me and I'll help you work around that. Now, one of the other topics that's come up over the last 2 days is around data and integration and sharing. In fact, Chris, I think you were talking about the way that the interoperability between systems. And this is absolutely not to be a wet blanket. Please, interchange and data is useful. And that's why I start with data collection and use does not necessarily equal a privacy violation. I know we're in a field where privacy is paramount, where privacy is something that is on everyone's mind. But at the same time, the mere act of collecting it for a use and getting someone's okay to do so is not necessarily a privacy violation. How you protect it and how you use it will determine that. But then at the same time, think about just because you can collect, just because you can share or move data between systems, does it mean you should? Have that contemplation. Know your ethical boundaries, know your company's your organization's ethical boundaries, and bring those into the discussion when deciding how to interoperate between systems, how to share information with third parties. And I'm not talking about, ads as third parties. I'm talking about, how you interchange between, researcher information with things like ORCID or with Mendeley or other things that you are, that are legitimate business partners. Know how it is, and then know what data is going in and out. Have a good inventory of it, keep track of it, and then go back and make sure that those connections still need the data that's going back and forth between them on a regular basis. Again, these are legitimate business interactions, so you do what you need to make sure, make the business happen, make the data useful, but just keep track of what it is and how you're doing it. And that is all the content I have. And I think that, and I think Todd, were there any questions through the course of the discussion?
Nothing came in so far, but I want to encourage people to, if you have any questions for Dan, please type them in. So a great talk, Dan. It is so worth mentioning how important these things can be, and important that you're on top of these things before you end up on the front page. It is, these are the sort of things, these are the sort of problems, these are the sort of challenges that if you don't spend time or effort or energy thinking about, you will end up making big mistakes that are not just costly dollar-wise, but also costly reputational risks. There are challenges, a stream of bad things can happen, not just the X thousand or million of dollars that you might have to pay if you are, if something badly goes wrong with your information security.
And reputation is as important in this. We're in the research, we're in the information space. So reputation is as important as availability. Reputation is a key piece of this. And ending up on the front page can impact your reputation in a way that it wouldn't say in retail. Retail, you take a small hit, people still need lumber, they go back to Home Depot. The information space is a bit different, especially if people start to feel they can't necessarily trust the content that's coming from you.
Yeah. There's a question here about small organizations, and I feel this one. How does a small organization with limited resources stay on top of information security?
It's difficult. I think one is finding people in your finding a network of people that share information, share threats. Oftentimes, you can tie into local security groups that are geographically aligned to you or that are industry aligned. There's a lot of great information sharing. If you're in an industry that has an ISAC, information sharing group, there's one for financial services, for critical services, for critical, all across the critical infrastructure. Go find those. There's also, and what I can do, Todd, is I can put a list of the sites and sources that I use, and we can distribute those if there's a way to do so. I just read a lot. I end up on, I still call it blog lines, but I end up on RSS readers a lot, just reading about things that are going on. And that's how I stay on top of a lot of things.
Yeah, I miss my favorite RSS readers. Another question, how do IT professionals think about federated authentication methods? Sorry, could you speak to how IT professionals think about these issues with federated authentication?
Yeah, well, at its base, and this comes back to the SSO, the request to do more single sign-on, I have two answers. One, social logins, Facebook, Google, etc., abhor, absolutely abhor them because there are strings attached to them. So there's data that goes back. So now I'm also a privacy person. So there's data that goes back to those organizations. You don't get them for free. However, federated using federation operators like in Common in the US or JISC or others, or SUNet, those are, I love the idea because those are further supporting the use of single sign-on from a trusted identity or from a more trusted identity. So I really like the idea. I was part of the Seamless, what now is RE21, what's now the Seamless project to try and bring more of that to accessing scholarly content. I remain a huge believer in that. I think it also with some of the changes in IP authentication, it's becoming a necessity to use something to log in, because your IP authentication, if you don't know, Safari, Apple just announced that IPs will now become by default obfuscated with the next release of both the phone and Mac OS later this year. So IP authentication is taking yet another hit. So using things like Seamless or federated identities is a great way to do it. And I really am supportive of the federation operators as a way to enable that, especially when doing cross communication between institutions and organizations.
Yeah, I love your point of how social auth comes with costs. You just don't know how you're paying for it.
It's just not out of your wallet or your credit card.
Yes. Dan, thank you so much. I know you're taking time from your holiday, so many thanks for that.
My
I really
pleasure.
appreciate
Thanks for
you
having me.
joining us. Always good to
and
see
if anyone
you.
has questions, please feel free to get in touch. My information's on the screen now. This is obviously something I really dislike talking about. No, I quite enjoy it. So please get in touch.
All right. Thank you so much, Dan. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a great day.